Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey there. Welcome back for another deep dive. You know how much we love to dig into the unexpected, right? And especially when it comes to history. It's like we get these kind of simplified versions of people, these famous figures, but there's always more to the story, isn't there?
Always.
So today, we're diving into Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Eisenhower.
Yeah, Eisenhower,
Right.
World War II hero, the I Like Ike president. But we're not talking about any of that.
Right.
Well, not exactly. What we're really digging into is Eisenhower and civil rights.
Yeah.
Get ready for some surprises, because this deep dive is going to reveal a side of him you might not expect.
Definitely.
Our source this time is this really interesting episode of Mr. Hutchings History. And it really gets into how Eisenhower approached civil rights, like how he used, or maybe didn't use, federal power to make change.
Fascinating stuff.
So think about the 1950s for a second. Okay. Post-war boom, yeah, but also this huge tension around race and segregation.
Yep.
And it's easy to think, oh, things moved slowly back then.
Right.
But did they? Or is that just like our simplified view of history talking?
It's such a good point.
Yeah.
We do tend to oversimplify, don't we? And Eisenhower is a perfect example of why we need to look closer. Because on the one hand, he was known for being cautious, right? Like, not a sweeping promises kind of guy.
Right.
Yet early on as president, he's making some pretty bold statements about tackling segregation head on.
It's a little contradictory, you know what I mean? So, what was the real Eisenhower approach here?
Well, that's the thing. He was a pragmatist. I mean, he knew he couldn't just change everybody's minds overnight.
Right.
But he could control federal spending,
Yeah.
and he saw that as leverage. It was like, okay, I can use this to force change where I have the power.
So, less about idealism, more like, what? Strategic use of resources. Like a general plotting a campaign almost.
Exactly. And we see this really clearly in his 1953 State of the Union address. He basically says flat out that no federal money should support discrimination. And he meant it. This wasn't just talk. Think about your own life, right? Ever had a boss who was all talk, no action?
No.
Eisenhower wasn't that guy. He got things done. And that was his style, even when it came to civil rights.
Okay, I'm starting to see the strategy here.
Yeah.
But what about desegregating the military? Isn't that more of a Truman thing?
Well, this is where the kind of the common narrative gets a little fuzzy. Because, yes, Truman started it, right, with Executive Order 9981.
Right.
But he met a ton of resistance. Eisenhower, on the other hand, he accelerated it. He even overrode his own Secretary of the Navy. Can you imagine having to push back against your own administration like that?
Wow. I didn't realize there was that much pushback.
Yep.
And that it wasn't just signing an order. He was willing to really, put his foot down to make it happen.
He was, and there's this great quote from him in this source. Eisenhower said, "There must be no second-class citizens in this country."
Powerful words.
Right.
Yep.
Not exactly known for fiery speeches, but man, that one.
That one lands. But knowing Eisenhower, I bet there's more to it than just, the moral stance, right?
You know it.
Got it.
Like, this wasn't just about morality for Ike. We're talking about the Cold War, remember? The Soviets were all over America's, racial inequality, using it as propaganda left and right.
Right.
Suddenly, civil rights become a national security issue for Eisenhower.
Whoa. That's a wild connection. Like, the fight for equality at home becomes this, weapon against the Soviets on the world stage.
Exactly.
So interesting. It's like this whole other side of the story, right? This whole strategic layer we don't always think about.
Totally.
And speaking of strategy, what about the laws Eisenhower actually got passed? The source mentions the Civil Rights Acts of 57 and 60.
Oh, yeah, those are big ones.
We tend to, focus on the big ones that came later in the 60s, but those earlier ones, huge deal.
Oh, wait.
Yeah, I mean, these were the first federal civil rights laws since Reconstruction. Think about that. Decades, literally decades, with basically zero progress at the federal level. Wow, I did not realize it had been that long.
Right. So 1957, boom, Civil Rights Act. Creates the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department, right?
Yeah.
Finally, someone to actually enforce this stuff.
Makes sense.
And they established the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, too, to investigate voting rights violations.
Yeah.
Small steps, maybe, but man, they shifted the whole game.
Okay, so he's setting precedents, laying the groundwork, like you said. But it makes you wonder, did people back then realize how significant that was? Or did it just feel like, I don't know, not enough?
It's such a good question, right? Imagine being alive then, having waited generations for real change. Do these laws feel like a victory? or just a tiny drop in the bucket.
Right, right.
And that's the tension Eisenhower's dealing with.
And then, of course, Little Rock happens. Talk about a turning point. And our source, it really brings that moment to life. Those 9 black students, the Little Rock 9, just trying to go to school.
Can you imagine being one of them? Just the courage to walk through those doors, the whole country watching, people screaming awful things.
It's hard to even fathom.
And Eisenhower, he's hesitant to use federal troops, right? He hated rocking the boat, but
he does it. He sends in the 101st Airborne. Man, I can't imagine making that call.
He federalized the Arkansas National Guard, too. First time since Reconstruction that the federal government sent troops to the South to protect the rights of Black Americans.
Wow.
Think about that image of those soldiers, those kids. That's Eisenhower taking a stand.
It's powerful. Like, that one image says more than any speech could.
Right. And it shows how complex Eisenhower was. He's not out there with the fiery speeches about equality. He's cautious, strategic.
Right.
But when he has to, he acts. And it's decisive. It's like those times in your life when you have to choose between what's easy and what's right, even when it's scary.
Oh, absolutely. We've all had those moments, even if the stakes weren't quite that high. But it makes you think, could Eisenhower have done more? Like, our source even asks that question.
It's so easy to look back and judge.
Right.
And there's always the what if. What if he'd been more outspoken, push harder, faster? But you got to remember the context, right? This is a time when even small steps on civil rights were seen as radical by a lot of people.
Right, right. And he's got a whole country to lead, not just the people who already agree with him. It's a balancing act, for sure. What do you think, though? How do we judge leaders who make, like, the incremental progress? Is it enough to lay the groundwork?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't know if there's an easy answer. Tough one. But it's like building a house, right?
Oh.
You can't just, like, throw up walls without a solid foundation.
Right.
And Eisenhower, he built that foundation. Legal precedents shifted the political landscape. He set the stage for everything that came after, those big advancements in the 60s.
That's true. But it makes you wonder, would those later victories have even happened without those earlier steps, the ones that maybe weren't as, headline grabbing?
Right. It's such a good point. It's like the whole great man of history debate. Was Eisenhower inevitable, or did he, like, seize the moment in a way someone else might not have?
Yeah, yeah. And how much credit do you give a leader when they're stuck working within a system that honestly isn't really set up for big, fast change?
Exactly. It's not like he could just snap his fingers and end segregation.
Right.
He had to deal with Congress, public opinion, even pushback within his own party. I think it reminds us that leadership isn't just speeches and grand gestures. It's also about, like, navigating the messy reality and finding a way forward,
It's the behind-the-scenes stuff, for sure.
Yeah, sure.
So where does all this leave us on Eisenhower? Hero, pragmatist, a little bit of both.
I think that's what makes these deep dives so great. It challenges those easy labels we try to put on historical figures. He wasn't perfect. Our source doesn't shy away from that. But he made the tough calls, pushed for progress when he could, and, like we were saying, built that foundation for others to build on.
Yeah, it makes me think of that quote. I think it's Bismarck. The best you can hope for from sausage and laws is to avoid watching either one being made. Sometimes progress is messy,
Haha. That's perfect. But the end result, a more just, equitable society. That's got to be worth a little mess, right?
100%.
Yeah.
And that's where we're left with a more complete understanding of Eisenhower, of his time, and really of how change actually happens.
Totally.
It's not always pretty or fast, but it's those steps along the way.
And it's something for all of us to think about, no matter what we're passionate about. Whatever we want to change in the world, it's probably not going to be a quick fix. It takes those steps, those moments of courage, and, yeah, sometimes even compromises.
Playing that long game, right. Like you were saying earlier, being strategic, but ready to act when you see the opening.
Exactly. Sometimes the most important changes aren't the ones everyone's talking about, but the ones that shift the ground beneath our feet. Slowly, but it happens.
Well said. Well, folks, there you have it, Eisenhower, the unexpected architect of civil rights. We hope this deep dive gave you a new perspective on history, leadership, and maybe even just, like, those everyday choices we all make that build a better future.
And remember, the deep dive doesn't end here. Keep asking questions, keep digging, keep those sources coming. Who knows what we'll uncover next time?
Until then, happy diving, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.